The Rise of a Genius, January 15, 1929, Atlanta, Georgia. In a modest two-story house on Auburn Avenue, a baby's cry pierces the winter air. The King family gathers around Alberta Williams King as she cradles her newborn son, Michael Luther King, Jr. His father, a Baptist minister, stands at the window, looking out at a city divided by the color of skin. Auburn Avenue is known as Sweet Auburn, a thriving center of black commerce and culture in the heart of the segregated South. But beyond this street, Atlanta is a city of whites-only signs, separate water fountains, and doors that remain forever closed to black citizens. Young Michael grows up surrounded by the walls of Ebenezer Baptist Church, where his father preaches every Sunday. The church is more than a building. It is sanctuary, community center, and the beating heart of Black Atlanta. His grandfather, Reverend Adam Daniel Williams, founded this church and made it a pillar of hope during the darkest days of Jim Crow. Michael's childhood home is filled with love, discipline, and the constant sound of gospel hymns. His mother, a schoolteacher and talented musician, sits at the piano teaching him hymns before he can even read. She tells him stories about dignity, about worth, about how God sees no difference between his children, but the world outside tells a different story. At age 6, Michael loses his two best friends. Their white parents forbid them from playing with him anymore. He runs home, tears streaming down his face, asking his mother why the world is this way. Alberta sits him down and explains the painful history of slavery, segregation, and racism in America. Then she looks into his eyes and says words that will echo through his entire life. You must never feel that you are less than anybody else. You must always feel that you are somebody. These words plant a seed that will grow into a revolution. In 1934, Michael's father travels to Germany and becomes inspired by the Protestant reformer Martin Luther. Upon returning, he changes both his name and his son's name to Martin Luther King. Young Martin Luther King, Jr. attends the segregated David T. Howard Elementary School. He's a bright student, curious and thoughtful, always asking questions that make adults uncomfortable. At age 12, his grandmother Jenny dies suddenly of a heart attack. Martin is devastated. He climbs to the second floor of his house and jumps out the window, trying to end his pain. He survives with minor injuries, but the incident reveals the depth of his emotional sensitivity. His father holds him tight and tells him that pain is part of life, but so is purpose. Martin throws himself into his studies, finding solace in books and ideas. He skips 9th and 12th grades, entering Morehouse College at just 15 years old. Morehouse is an all-black institution, a place where young black men can study without the weight of white supremacy on their shoulders. Here, Martin encounters Dr. Benjamin Mays, the college president who becomes his spiritual mentor. Mays preaches a gospel of social justice, arguing that Christianity demands action against oppression. For the first time, Martin sees how faith and activism can merge into a powerful force for change. He joins the debate team and discovers he has a gift for oratory, a voice that can move hearts and minds. But Martin is conflicted about following in his father's footsteps into the ministry. He considers becoming a doctor or a lawyer, professions that might allow him to fight injustice in different ways. During his junior year, he reads Henry David Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience. The idea strikes him like lightning, that citizens have a moral duty to resist unjust laws. In his senior year, Martin finally decides to enter the ministry, but on his own terms. He will not simply preach about heaven, he will work to make earth more heavenly. In 1948, at age 19, he graduates from Morehouse College with a degree in sociology. He delivers the valedictory speech, his voice ringing with passion and purpose. You are watching iconic figures. Stay with us until the end to discover how this story shaped history. Martin enrolls at Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, one of the few integrated seminaries in America. For the first time in his life, he attends school alongside white students. The experience is jarring, liberating, and complex all at once. At Crozer, he discovers the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, whose non-violent resistance freed India from British rule. Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha, or soul force, captivates Martin's imagination. He realizes that love and non-violence are not signs of weakness, but weapons more powerful than any gun. Martin devours books on philosophy, theology, and social theory. He reads Reinhold Niebuhr, Walter Rauschenbusch, and Karl Marx, wrestling with questions of sin, justice, and power. His professors are impressed by his intellect and his ability to synthesize complex ideas. But some white students resent his presence, viewing him as an affirmative action case rather than an equal. Martin responds not with anger, but with excellence, determined to prove himself through his work. In 1951, he graduates from Crozer as valedictorian and wins a fellowship to continue his studies. He chooses Boston University for his doctoral work, pursuing a PhD in systematic theology. Boston is a northern city, supposedly more progressive than the South, but Martin quickly learns that racism wears different masks in different places. He cannot find decent housing in white neighborhoods. Restaurants serve him slowly or not at all. The subtle discrimination of the North is in some ways more insidious than the overt racism of the South. But Boston also brings him the greatest gift of his life. At a friend's urging, he calls a young woman named Coretta Scott, a talented singer studying at the New England Conservatory of Music. Their first date lasts for hours. They talk about music, justice, dreams, and destiny. Coretta is from Alabama, and she understands the weight of the Southern black experience. She is beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely independent, with her own dreams of a musical career. Martin tells her on their first date that she has all the qualities he wants in a wife: character, intelligence, personality, and beauty. Coretta is charmed but cautious. She senses that marrying Martin would mean sacrificing some of her own ambitions. But she also feels drawn to his vision, his purpose, his unshakable belief that the world can change. On June 18, 1953, they marry on the lawn of Coretta's parents' home in Marion, Alabama. Martin's father performs the ceremony, joining two souls who will walk through history together. The newlyweds return to Boston, where Martin completes his dissertation on the conception of God in the theologies of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Weeman. It is dense, academic work, but even here Martin's concern for justice and human dignity shines through. In 1954, as Martin finishes his doctoral research, the Supreme Court delivers its landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision. Segregation in public schools is ruled unconstitutional. The legal foundation of Jim Crow begins to crack. Martin and Coretta discuss their future. Should they stay in the North or return to the South? The South is dangerous, hostile, and suffocating, but it is also home, and it is where the battle must be fought. Martin receives several job offers, but one stands out: Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. Montgomery is the first capital of the Confederacy, a city steeped in the history of slavery and rebellion. But Martin feels called to this place, sensing that history is about to turn. In September 1954, at age 25, Martin Luther King Jr. becomes the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He preaches his first sermon with fire and conviction, calling his congregation to social action. Coretta sits in the front pew, watching her husband step into his destiny. The Kings settle into a modest parsonage on South Jackson Street. Montgomery is a city of rigid segregation. Black citizens must sit at the back of buses, give up their seats to white passengers, and enter through rear doors. These indignities happen every single day, grinding down the spirit of an entire people. But in the homes, churches, and beauty parlors of Black Montgomery, anger is quietly building. The community is waiting for a spark, for a moment when enough becomes enough. Martin joins the local NAACP chapter and begins connecting with other activists and ministers. He preaches about justice, about dignity, about the moral obligation to resist evil systems. His congregation listens, inspired by this young preacher who speaks with such clarity and passion. In November 1955, Coretta gives birth to their first child, Yolanda Denise King. Martin holds his daughter and prays that she will grow up in a better world. He has no idea that in just a few weeks, his life and the course of American history will change forever. Discoveries that changed humanity, December 1st, 1955. Montgomery, Alabama. A 42-year-old seamstress named Rosa Parks boards the Cleveland Avenue bus after a long day of work. She takes a seat in the middle section, the area where black passengers are allowed to sit if no white passengers need the space. The bus fills up, and a white man boards, demanding her seat. The driver, James Blake, orders Rosa and 3 other black passengers to move. The others comply. Rosa Parks does not. She is arrested, fingerprinted, and jailed for violating Montgomery's segregation laws. That evening, news of her arrest spreads through Black Montgomery like wildfire. Rosa Parks is not just anyone. She is a respected NAACP member, a woman of impeccable character. Community leaders gather to discuss a response, and someone suggests a one-day bus boycott. Martin Luther King Jr. is invited to a meeting at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He is one of the youngest ministers in the room, but his eloquence and moral clarity impress everyone. The Montgomery Improvement Association is formed, and to Martin's surprise, he is elected president. At age 26, he suddenly finds himself leading a movement he did not start. On December 5th, the boycott begins. Black citizens stay off the buses in massive numbers, walking, carpooling, riding mules, and traveling on foot through rain and heat. That evening, Martin addresses a crowd of thousands at Holt Street Baptist Church. He has had less than 20 minutes to prepare his speech, but when he stands at the pulpit, the words flow like prophecy. He speaks of Rosa Parks's courage, of the long history of injustice, of the power of unified action. "We are here because we are tired," he declares, "tired of being segregated and humiliated, tired of being kicked about by the brutal feet of oppression." The crowd erupts in applause, shouting, "Amen and yes, Lord." Martin tells them that they will protest with the weapon of love, that they will meet hate with love and violence with nonviolence. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. The boycott that was supposed to last one day stretches into weeks, then months. Montgomery's black community walks with dignity, organizing carpools and support systems. White city officials are furious, threatening, harassing, and arresting boycott leaders. Martin receives hate mail and death threats daily. His phone rings at all hours with anonymous voices promising to kill him and his family. On January 30th, 1956, while Martin is at a mass meeting, a bomb explodes on the front porch of his home. Coretta and baby Yolanda are inside but escape injury. An angry black crowd gathers outside the damaged house, many armed and ready to fight. Martin rushes home and steps onto the porch, facing his own people on the verge of violence. "We must love our white brothers no matter what they do to us," he tells them. "We must meet hate with love." The crowd disperses peacefully, and in that moment, Martin proves that nonviolence is not passive, but a force of extraordinary moral power. The boycott continues for 381 days, crippling Montgomery's bus system economically. Martin and other leaders are arrested for conspiracy to interfere with business. The trial becomes a media sensation, putting Montgomery's racism on display for the world to see. Martin is convicted and fined, but the movement only grows stronger. Behind the scenes, NAACP lawyers file a federal lawsuit challenging bus segregation. On November 13, 1956, the Supreme Court rules that Alabama's bus segregation laws are unconstitutional. When the news reaches Montgomery, the black community erupts in celebration. On December 21st, Martin Luther King Jr. boards a Montgomery bus and sits in the front row. The boycott is over, and a movement is born. Martin's leadership during the boycott makes him a national figure overnight, appearing on the cover of Time magazine and receiving invitations to speak across the country. In 1957, Martin and other civil rights leaders formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, to coordinate nonviolent protests across the South, using the church as its organizing base. Martin is elected president, cementing his role as the face of the civil rights movement. He travels constantly, speaking at churches, colleges, and rallies, spreading the gospel of nonviolent resistance. His speeches blend Christian theology, American ideals, and Gandhian philosophy into a vision of beloved community. He tells audiences that segregation is not only politically wrong, but morally evil, a cancer eating at America's soul. In 1959, Martin and Coretta traveled to India, walking in the footsteps of Mahatma Gandhi. He meets with Gandhi's followers and visits the places where the independence movement was born. The trip deepens his commitment to nonviolence and gives him a broader perspective on global liberation struggles. Returning to America, Martin moves his family to Atlanta to be closer to the SCLC headquarters. He becomes co-pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church alongside his father, balancing family expectations with his growing national role. But the movement faces enormous challenges as progress is slow, resistance is fierce, and violence is constant. In 1960, young black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, stage a sit-in at a segregated lunch counter. The sit-in movement spreads like wildfire across the South, led by a new generation of activists. Martin supports the students and helps form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. He participates in a sit-in at Rich's department store in Atlanta and is arrested along with dozens of students. While other protesters are released, Martin is sentenced to 4 months of hard labor for a minor traffic violation. His imprisonment becomes a national scandal, and Coretta, pregnant with their third child, fears for his life. Presidential candidate John F. Kennedy calls Coretta to express concern, and his brother Robert Kennedy intervenes behind the scenes. Martin is released, and the incident helps Kennedy secure crucial black votes in the 1960 election. In 1961, Freedom Riders, black and white activists, ride interstate buses through the South to challenge segregation in bus terminals. They are met with horrific violence as buses are firebombed and riders are beaten bloody. Martin supports the Freedom Riders but faces criticism for not joining them on the most dangerous routes. It is a painful tension. As the movement's most visible leader, his death could cripple the entire cause. In 1962, Martin is invited to Albany, Georgia, to support a local desegregation campaign. The Albany movement draws national attention, but it fails to achieve its goals. Martin learns hard lessons about strategy, about choosing battles carefully, and about the limits of moral witness without political leverage. He vows that the next major campaign will be different, more focused and strategic. That campaign will take place in Birmingham, Alabama, known as the most segregated city in America. In April 1963, Martin and the SCLC launch Project C for Confrontation in Birmingham. They organize marches, sit-ins, and boycotts, deliberately provoking arrest to fill the jails and expose injustice. Birmingham's Public Safety Commissioner, Bull Connor, is a notorious racist who promises to meet protests with force. Martin is arrested on Good Friday and placed in solitary confinement. In his cell, he reads a newspaper article in which white clergy criticize the protests as untimely and extreme. Angry and inspired, Martin begins writing a response in the margins of the newspaper and on scraps of paper. What emerges is the letter from Birmingham jail, one of the most important documents in American history. In it, Martin argues that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, that there is never a convenient time for justice, and that nonviolent direct action forces society to confront its moral failings. The letter is smuggled out of jail and published, becoming a manifesto for the movement. After Martin's release, the campaign intensifies as young people, some as young as 6 years old, join the marches. Bull Connor orders police to attack the children with fire hoses and attack dogs. The images are broadcast on television and published in newspapers around the world. The sight of children being slammed against walls by water cannons shocks the American conscience. International pressure mounts, and the Kennedy administration intervenes. Birmingham's business leaders agree to desegregate lunch counters and hire black workers. It is a victory, but it comes at a terrible cost as bombs explode at black homes and churches. On September 15, 1963, the 16th Street Baptist Church is bombed during Sunday school. 4 young girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair, are killed. Martin delivers the eulogy, his voice breaking with grief and rage. "They did not die in vain," he tells the mourners. "God still has a way of wringing good out of evil." But privately, Martin wonders how much more sacrifice this movement will demand. The success in Birmingham paves the way for the movement's greatest moment. On August 28, 1963, 250,000 people gather at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Martin is the final speaker of the day, scheduled to deliver remarks near the end of the program. He has prepared a speech, but as he begins, he senses it is not connecting with the crowd. Gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, standing nearby, calls out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." Martin sets aside his prepared text and begins to speak from his heart. "I have a dream," he says, and the crowd leans in. He dreams of a nation where his children will be judged, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He dreams of former slaves and former slave owners sitting together at the table of brotherhood. He dreams of freedom ringing from every mountain and hillside. His voice rises and falls like a preacher at the pulpit, and the crowd responds with tears and shouts of joy. The speech is broadcast live on television and heard by millions. It becomes the defining moment of the civil rights movement, an expression of hope that transcends race and time. In 1964, Martin is named Time magazine's Man of the Year, the first black person to receive the honor. On July 2nd, President Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act into law, outlawing segregation in public places and employment discrimination. Martin is present at the signing, witnessing the legal fulfillment of years of struggle. In October, he receives word that he has been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. At 35, he is the youngest person ever to receive the honor. In Oslo, Norway, Martin accepts the prize on behalf of the movement, donating the entire monetary award to civil rights organizations. "I accept this award today with an abiding faith in America and an audacious faith in the future of mankind," he says. But even as the world celebrates, Martin knows the work is far from over. Battles, doubts, and triumphs. January 1965. Selma, Alabama. A small city where black citizens make up half the population, but only 2% are registered to vote. Local officials use literacy tests, poll taxes, and outright intimidation to prevent black voting. Martin and the SCLC arrive in Selma to launch a voting rights campaign. They organize marches to the courthouse, where black citizens attempt to register to vote and are turned away. Sheriff Jim Clark is a brutal enforcer who beats protesters and arrests them by the hundreds. On February 18th, state troopers attack a nighttime march in nearby Marion. In the chaos, a young man named Jimmy Lee Jackson is shot by a state trooper while trying to protect his mother. He dies 8 days later, and his death galvanizes the movement. Leaders plan a march from Selma to the state capital in Montgomery, a 54-mile journey. On March 7th, 600 marchers set out across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. On the other side, they are met by state troopers and a mounted posse. The order is given to disperse. The marchers kneel to pray. Then the troopers charge, swinging clubs, firing tear gas, and trampling people with horses. The attack is savage and indiscriminate. Dozens are hospitalized with fractured skulls and broken bones. The images of Bloody Sunday, as it becomes known, shock the nation. Martin, who was not present that day, vows to lead another march. 2 days later, he leads 1,500 people back to the bridge. But this time, after a tense standoff, Martin turns the marchers around following a secret agreement with federal officials. Many activists feel betrayed, accusing Martin of compromising. That night, white supremacists attack 3 white ministers who came to support the march. Reverend James Reeb is beaten to death, his murder sparking even more outrage than Jimmy Lee Jackson's death, a painful reminder that white lives are valued more than black ones. President Johnson addresses Congress and the nation, calling for a Voting Rights Act. Their cause must be our cause too, he says, invoking the movement's rallying cry, "We shall overcome." On March 21st, with federal protection, Martin leads thousands on the march from Selma to Montgomery. They walk through rain and cold, camping in fields at night, singing freedom songs. 5 days later, they reach Montgomery, where Martin addresses a crowd of 25,000. "How long? Not long," he declares, his voice ringing with certainty, "because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." On August 6th, President Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act, one of the most significant pieces of legislation in American history. It is a monumental victory, but Martin has little time to celebrate. Just 5 days later, riots erupt in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles. 34 people die in 6 days of violence, revealing deep frustration in black communities outside the South. Martin travels to Watts and is confronted by angry young people who reject his philosophy of non-violence. "We won," they tell him, referring to the Voting Rights Act. "How come we got nothing?" Martin realizes that legal equality is not enough. The movement must now address poverty, unemployment, and economic injustice. He begins speaking more boldly about economic inequality and the need for radical restructuring of American society. In 1966, Martin moves his family to a slum apartment in Chicago to launch the Chicago Freedom Movement. The campaign targets housing discrimination and economic exploitation in northern cities. But Chicago proves to be Martin's toughest fight yet. Mayor Richard Daley is politically savvy and resists direct confrontation. White ethnic neighborhoods respond to integration efforts with hatred more vicious than anything Martin has seen in the South. During a march through Marquette Park, white mobs throw rocks and bottles at protesters. A rock strikes Martin in the head, knocking him to his knees. "I have seen many demonstrations in the South, but I have never seen anything so hostile and so hateful as I've seen here today," he says. The Chicago campaign ends with minimal concessions and is widely viewed as a failure. Martin is exhausted, depressed, and increasingly isolated. Younger activists in SNCC and the Black Power movement criticize his commitment to nonviolence as outdated. Stokely Carmichael and other militants argue that black people must defend themselves and seize power by any means necessary. Martin understands their anger, but fears that violence will lead to destruction and martial law. The split within the movement breaks his heart, but he refuses to abandon his principles. Meanwhile, the Vietnam War is escalating, and Martin faces a moral crisis. He sees the war as unjust, draining resources from domestic poverty programs while killing poor people of all races. But his advisors warn that opposing the war will alienate President Johnson and mainstream white supporters. Martin wrestles with the decision for months, praying and agonizing. On April 4th, 1967, at Riverside Church in New York, he delivers a speech titled "Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence." He calls the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today and links civil rights, poverty, and militarism as interconnected evils. The speech is met with fierce backlash. Major newspapers condemn him, the NAACP distances itself from his position, and President Johnson is furious and cuts off communication with Martin. Even some of Martin's closest allies believe he has made a catastrophic mistake, but Martin feels liberated, finally speaking the truth as he sees it. "I have worked too long and hard now against segregated accommodations to end up segregating my moral concerns," he says. He begins planning the Poor People's Campaign, a multiracial movement to demand economic justice. The campaign will bring thousands of poor people to Washington, D.C. to occupy the National Mall until Congress addresses poverty. It is Martin's most radical vision yet, calling for guaranteed income, full employment, and affordable housing. But the campaign struggles to gain momentum. Martin is tired, and the movement is fractured. In February 1968, sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, go on strike for better wages and working conditions. They carry signs that read, "I am a man," a simple demand for dignity. Martin is invited to support the strike and sees it as a perfect embodiment of the Poor People's Campaign. On March 18th, he addresses a crowd of thousands in Memphis, and the response is electric. He promises to return and lead a march on behalf of the workers. On March 28th, Martin leads a march through downtown Memphis, but the march descends into chaos as some young protesters break windows and loot stores. Police respond with violence, and one teenager is killed. Martin is devastated. It is the first time one of his marches has turned violent. Critics pounce, arguing that this proves nonviolence is dead and that Martin has lost control. He returns to Memphis determined to prove that nonviolent protest can still work. On April 3rd, Martin addresses a crowd at Mason Temple Church. He is exhausted and suffering from a sore throat, but when he begins to speak, the old fire returns. He talks about the threats against his life, the constant fear, and the temptation to give up. Then his voice rises. "But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." Tears stream down his face. The crowd is on its feet, shouting and crying. It is as if Martin knows what is coming. With the decision for months, praying and agonizing. On April 4th, 1967, at Riverside Church in New York, he delivers a speech titled "Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence." He calls the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today and links civil rights, poverty, and militarism as interconnected evils. The speech is met with fierce backlash. Major newspapers condemn him. The NAACP distances itself from his position. President Johnson is furious and cuts off communication with Martin. Even some of Martin's closest allies believe he has made a catastrophic mistake. But Martin feels liberated, finally speaking the truth as he sees it. "I have worked too long and hard now against segregated accommodations to end up segregating my moral concerns," he says. He begins planning the Poor People's Campaign, a multiracial movement to demand economic justice. The campaign will bring thousands of poor people to Washington, D.C. to occupy the National Mall until Congress addresses poverty. It's Martin's most radical vision yet, calling for guaranteed income, full employment, and affordable housing, but the campaign struggles to gain momentum. Martin is tired and the movement is fractured. In February 1968, sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, go on strike for better wages and working conditions. They carry signs that read, "I am a man," a simple demand for dignity. Martin is invited to support the strike and sees it as a perfect embodiment of the Poor People's Campaign. On March 18th, he addresses a crowd of thousands in Memphis, and the response is electric. He promises to return and lead a march on behalf of the workers. On March 28th, Martin leads a march through downtown Memphis. But the march descends into chaos as some young protesters break windows and loot stores. Police respond with violence, and one teenager is killed. Martin is devastated. It is the first time one of his marches has turned violent. Critics pounce, arguing that this proves nonviolence is dead and that Martin has lost control. He returns to Memphis determined to prove that nonviolent protest can still work. On April 3rd, Martin addresses a crowd at Mason Temple Church. He is exhausted and suffering from a sore throat, but when he begins to speak, the old fire returns. He talks about the threats against his life, the constant fear, and the temptation to give up. Then his voice rises. "But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." Tears stream down his face. The crowd is on its feet, shouting and crying. It is as if Martin knows what is coming. The last days of a legend, April 4th, 1968. The Lorraine Motel, Memphis, Tennessee. Martin wakes late after a restless night, spending the morning in meetings and planning the march scheduled for April 8th. Despite the violence of the previous march, he is determined to prove that non-violence can still triumph. The mood is lighter than it has been in weeks, as Martin jokes with his aides and talks about the future. Around noon, his brother Alfred arrives with their mother, and they share lunch together. In the afternoon, Martin meets with local ministers and activists, discussing strategy and building support. As evening approaches, he retreats to room 306 to rest and prepare for dinner. His close friend and fellow minister, Reverend Samuel Kiles, invites the group to his home for a meal. Martin's mood is unusually playful as he teases his aides and jokes about the food they will eat. At 6 p.m., Martin steps onto the balcony of the motel, breathing in the cool evening air. Below, in the parking lot, his driver waits by the car. Martin leans on the railing, calling down to musician Ben Branch to play Precious Lord Take My Hand at that night's meeting. A single shot rings out, echoing across the motel courtyard. The bullet strikes Martin in the jaw, severing his spinal cord and tearing through his neck. He collapses onto the balcony, blood pooling around him. His aides rush to his side, screaming for help, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. An ambulance arrives within minutes and races Martin to St. Joseph's Hospital. Doctors work frantically, but the damage is too severe. At 7:05 p.m., Martin Luther King Jr. is pronounced dead. He is 39 years old. The news spreads across the nation like a shockwave. In cities across America, grief turns to rage as riots erupt in more than 100 cities. Buildings burn, streets fill with soldiers, and dozens of people die in the chaos. President Johnson declares a national day of mourning and deploys federal troops to restore order. In Atlanta, Coretta Scott King prepares to bury her husband, her face a mask of grief and strength. She insists that Martin's funeral honor his commitment to the poor and to nonviolence. On April 9th, a funeral service is held at Ebenezer Baptist Church, packed with mourners. Dignitaries, celebrities, and ordinary citizens gather to pay their respects. But the most powerful moment comes when Martin's own voice fills the church. Just 2 months earlier, he had preached a sermon at Ebenezer about his own funeral. "If any of you are around when I have to meet my day, I don't want a long funeral," his recorded voice says. "Tell them not to mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize. Tell them not to mention that I have 300 or 400 other awards. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to say that I tried to feed the hungry. I want you to be able to say that I tried to love and serve humanity." There is not a dry eye in the church. After the service, a mule-drawn wagon carries Martin's casket through the streets of Atlanta. 50,000 people follow on foot, walking in silence through the city he called home. Martin is laid to rest at Southview Cemetery, his tombstone bearing the words from his "I Have a Dream" speech. "Free at last, thank God Almighty, I'm free at last." The search for Martin's killer leads to James Earl Ray, a small-time criminal and white supremacist. Ray is captured in London 2 months later and pleads guilty to the murder, receiving a 99-year sentence. But questions about the assassination persist for decades, with conspiracy theories suggesting broader involvement. What is certain is that Martin's death created a void that could never be filled. In the months following his assassination, the Poor People's Campaign continues without him. Thousands camp in Washington, building Resurrection City on the National Mall. But without Martin's leadership and moral authority, the campaign struggles and ultimately fails to achieve its goals. The civil rights movement fragments, with some activists embracing black power and others turning to electoral politics. Coretta Scott King becomes the keeper of her husband's legacy, establishing the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change in Atlanta. She fights for 15 years to make Martin's birthday a federal holiday, facing opposition from those who see him as too radical. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan signs the bill making the third Monday in January Martin Luther King Jr. Day. It is the first federal holiday honoring an African American. Martin's 4 children grow up in the shadow of their father's legacy, each grappling with the weight of his name. Yolanda becomes an actress and activist. Martin Luther King III follows his father into ministry and civil rights work. Dexter King pursues business and media ventures, and Bernice King becomes a minister and continues her father's work. The family sometimes clashes over how to preserve and honor Martin's legacy, revealing the complexity of carrying such a burden. In the decades since his death, Martin's image has been sanitized and commodified, his radical edge softened for mass consumption. He is often remembered only for the "I Have a Dream" speech, his message reduced to a plea for colorblindness. But Martin's actual vision was far more challenging and transformative. He called for economic restructuring, condemned American militarism, and linked racism to capitalism and imperialism. He saw poverty as a form of violence and argued that true equality required more than legal rights. Near the end of his life, he said that America needed a revolution of values, a fundamental reordering of priorities. These more radical aspects of his thought are often forgotten or ignored. Yet Martin's influence on American life is undeniable. The Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, achieved in large part through his leadership, transformed the legal landscape of America. His philosophy of nonviolent resistance inspired movements around the world, from South Africa to Burma to the Arab Spring. His speeches remain among the most quoted and studied in American history. His example of moral courage in the face of hatred continues to inspire new generations. Martin's legacy is also complicated and contested. Some argue that his emphasis on nonviolence and integration left structural racism intact. Others believe he moved too slowly or compromised too much with white power structures. Still others claim he would have opposed contemporary movements like Black Lives Matter or would have been more conservative on social issues. The truth is that Martin was constantly evolving, always pushing himself and the nation toward a more radical vision of justice. He was not a saint, but a human being, with flaws and contradictions, struggling to live up to his own ideals. He battled depression, wrestled with his own moral failures, and sometimes felt overwhelmed by the weight of leadership. But he kept going, kept speaking, kept marching, even when he knew it might cost him his life. Today, more than 50 years after his death, Martin's dream remains unfulfilled. America has made progress on racial equality, but deep inequalities persist in education, wealth, healthcare, and criminal justice. Police violence against Black Americans continues, sparking protests that echo the demonstrations Martin led. Economic inequality has grown to levels he would have found unconscionable. Militarism and war remain central to American foreign policy. The beloved community Martin envisioned, where people are judged by character rather than color, where poverty is abolished and violence renounced, seems as distant as ever. Yet his words still resonate, still challenge, still inspire hope. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. These are not empty platitudes, but calls to action, reminders that progress requires sacrifice and struggle. Martin's legacy is not a finished monument, but an ongoing project, a challenge to each generation to continue the work he began. He showed that ordinary people, armed with courage and conviction, can change the world. He proved that love is more powerful than hate, that nonviolence can overcome oppression, that hope can triumph over despair. In the end, Martin Luther King Jr.'s greatest achievement was not any single law or speech, but the example of his life. He showed what it means to live with integrity, to stand for justice even when it costs everything, to believe in humanity's capacity for redemption. He was a prophet who called America to live up to its stated ideals, a dreamer who imagined a better world and gave his life trying to create it. His voice, stilled by an assassin's bullet on a Memphis motel balcony, still echoes through the generations, calling us to be better, to do better, to never give up the fight for justice. Martin Luther King Jr. lived only 39 years, but in that brief time, he changed the course of history. He freed not just Black Americans, but all Americans from the chains of hatred and fear. He showed that one person, speaking truth with courage, can inspire millions and transform a nation. His dream lives on in every act of resistance against injustice, every march for equality, every voice raised against oppression. As long as people struggle for freedom, Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy will endure. As long as the fight for justice continues, his spirit marches with us. And perhaps one day, the beloved community he envisioned will finally be realized. Free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, we will be free at last. This was another episode of Iconic Figures. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful documentaries about the minds and leaders who changed the world.